Growing up along the Rio Perco Valley and hearing stories of how our communities were very self-sufficient. We had robust food systems, but it became very evident to me growing up that something must have changed relatively quickly from my parents' generation to ours. My name is Janine Yazi. I'm Dene from the Navajo Nation, and I'm an Indigenous rights and human rights advocate and currently the Director of Policy and Advocacy for Indian Collective.
Janine's just returned from a trip to Nairobi for negotiations related to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And she's rushing through lunch as she tells us about the moment that she realized just how different her life was from her parents and her grandparents.
We drank a lot of bottled water. We didn't depend a lot on the running water. I started to ask questions about this. And that kind of led me to understand that a lot of our water systems were contaminated by uranium production, uranium mining, and then culminating in the 1979 Church Rock uranium mill tilling spill.
The Church Rock disaster released 3 times more radioactivity than 3 Mile Island, the infamous reactor meltdown in Pennsylvania that happened the same year. And Church Rock, it changed the surrounding Navajo lands forever.
It became apparent that those activities completely destroyed our food systems and our way of living with a feeling of safety in our communities because everything became dangerous.
In response, the U.S. government basically gaslit the indigenous people living on those lands. The governor of New Mexico refused to call the incident a federal disaster, which would have made more funds and resources available to address the spill. And the EPA took years to prioritize the site for cleanup. At the time, it even reported no long-term effects of the spill. But that's not what Janine sees 45 years later.
My most recent memory was when we did the Perco Valley Little Colorado River water quality testing project, where we exposed, the extent of the contamination that still exists there and got hard data to show that contamination. Was getting the call that the water system for the entire school, the school that I attended from kindergarten to 8th grade, the school that my son was currently attending, was on a contaminated water system that had uranium in it 3 times above the acceptable drinking limit. And feeling so guilty as a mom and as an Indigenous woman that my desire to return home to my community and to help my people and to build a good life for my children that kept them connected to who they were and who their people were and where lands they came from, inadvertently exposed them to this harm.
And still, there's little help.
Part of that experience was when we had to tell the communities this, and officials came out and both trying to tell them that because they didn't pay the same amount of water rates as water users in Arizona generally, that they shouldn't complain.
And the burden of proof often falls on those most impacted.
Unsurprisingly, there's little to no resources to really support that type of research. And it's one of the systemic inequalities that keeps us from getting the type of answers and solutions and remediation that is necessary and that is possible are for addressing any of the endemic public health issues that our communities are facing.
Meaning that many of these issues go unaddressed and will continue to affect generations of people to come.
Radiation can't be cleaned up very quickly, easily. It's in the soil.
The real concern is a long-term or chronic exposure to these compounds over, say, a 20 or 30-year period, which could, in fact, lead to cancer in many cases.
Some babies are being born with uranium in their bodies equivalent to adult male minors. And when we're talking about female fetuses, our fetuses of female sex, which develop all of the eggs they'll ever carry in their lifetime while in the womb, you're talking about 3 generations right there being directly impacted by something that can't be remediated. We don't have technology to take uranium out of the body.
It's a problem that Janine has dedicated her life to solving. But she says that the fight for clean water, it flows everywhere from the Navajo Nation to Flint, Michigan. And she's quick to point out that the mentality that led to the Church Rock disaster, it doesn't stop at the water's edge.
There's a link between domestic and foreign policy when you understand it from the framework of colonization and settler colonialism and the ways that those continue to be carried out. And ultimately, it's because these things are rooted in a culture of violence.
We have, the last 2 years, given a significant increase to the defense budget. over and above the president's budget.
U.S. strikes throughout Iraq and Syria, and now we're just learning about a separate specific strike.
The first $700 million will go to tank ammunition, about $500 million tactical vehicles, and just under $100 million on mortar rounds.
People are being raised very effectively through our education system to look at the U.S. as a model and champion of human rights, of equality, and of democracy. I feel like we've constantly been trying to raise the alarm and be like, no, it's not really that way. If you just lift up the veil a little bit, you'll see.
And when you do lift up that veil, she told us it becomes a little easier to see another path, one that brings her two worlds, foreign policy and Indigenous rights, together.
When I first heard about a feminist foreign policy initiative, I saw its connectivity to some of the values and principles that guide our work in advocating for more just domestic policies and for protection of treaty rights and for protection of self-determination. Because when Indigenous peoples are advocating for these things, we're not advocating for the right to tax our own people. It's not for the right to throw our own people in prison. We're advocating for our right to self-determination, to build alternative models that are more in line with our values and principles as human beings that have a responsibility to care for one another and to care about our interconnectivity with Mother Earth and our interdependency with Mother Earth. And so at its base, that's why Indigenous rights and Indigenous perspective, worldviews, language systems have always been in conflict with the dominant culture, because we come from a culture of care and a culture of peace. And that's going to always come into conflict with the culture of violence.
But as much as they might have in common, getting Indigenous rights activists and feminist foreign policy activists on the same page, it can still be a challenge.
I feel like sometimes I'm shouting into the void in both spaces and the Indigenous rights movement, we got to care about foreign policy, but not just as it applies to us and treaty rights, but as it applies to everyone. And then in other places, we need more Indigenous voices here, not just because we're cool, but because we have our own expertise to offer, not just for the land acknowledgements or the prayer, but for the actual scientific and lived expertise that can inform these approaches.
We've spent this whole season talking about feminist foreign policies around the world, how they do and how they don't disrupt the status quo. And the U.S. is no different. So today, on our last episode of the season, we are bringing it home. We wanted to know, would the U.S. ever actually adopt a feminist foreign policy? And what would that even mean? I'm Lacey Healy, and this is Things That Go Boom. Let's not sugarcoat it. The feminists that we spoke to have some serious issues with how the U.S. is running its foreign policy.
There's not one thing that the U.S. state is doing right regarding feminism.
Sometimes even the fiercest of champions suddenly have a hard time seeing.
I'd say we're not doing very well.
Quite the contrary.
America's weak response to the devastation of civilians in Palestine is one example, but there are many. On the other hand, in 2021, the Biden administration actually released the first ever national strategy on gender equity and equality. And it created something called the Gender Policy Council.
With the release of the United States' first ever national strategy on gender equity and equality, the administration reaffirmed that advancing the rights and empowerment of women and girls in all their diversity is both a moral and a strategic imperative.
So we wanted to get behind the scenes to figure out where the U.S. really is along the pathway to a feminist foreign policy, and how the fight for a better system is actually going. To help answer that question, I headed to a USAID conference on gender in D.C., where I met with Lyric Thompson. Lyric is the founding CEO of the Feminist Foreign Policy Collaborative, an initiative that she created in the early days of the policy. Because even back then, Sweden's 3 Rs, they felt a little weak. So she went out to ask others what they thought feminist foreign policy should be. Lyric held a series of roundtable talks, one of which, full disclosure, I attended.
I did one at
the one on nukes.
She targeted a diverse group that went beyond the halls of government, and she did that for a reason.
I spend most of my time first with civil society, with the academics and activists, because I wanted to, in my process as well, listen first to those impacted. But that also means that you're likely going to have a much more ambitious, principled standard that you're articulating.
And the standard that they came up with?
People, peace, planet. So human rights, but not just women. Feminist foreign policy has a bit of a messaging problem. It's regarded as women-y foreign policy. It is much bigger. It's about using that power lens to understand who's being disenfranchised. And 9 times out of 10, that's probably women. But what else is going on here? And how do we use our lens to then use the levers of foreign policy and those powers to try to correct for some of those?
The collaborative didn't hold back. It was clear about where current feminist foreign policies were working and where they weren't.
And so I can remember the first time that I brought a draft of the definition that we ultimately published to the governments.
These were the 5 governments that, at the time, were leading the charge on feminism in foreign policy.
So it was Sweden, Luxembourg, Mexico, Canada, France. And I was anticipating a great deal of pushback. And like, this is pie in the sky. It'll never get there. The whole thing is feminist foreign policy. If it's going to be everybody, if it's going to be anti-colonial, and if it's going to be LGBTQ, and if it's going to be all these different constituencies, then it's everything, and therefore it's nothing. I was prepared for that. I had my kind of back pocket responses ready. And they were all like, yeah, this looks good. And I was like, I mean, did you read? It's not even fine print. We bolded the pain points here.
Pain points like arms sales, historical legacies of military intervention and colonization, actions to address climate change, investments in gender equality, and, quote, the tendency to use the word feminist when they refer to a policy that focuses overwhelmingly on women and girls. Of course, despite the enthusiasm in the room, things didn't immediately change.
Admittedly, the folks in those rooms were not the foreign ministers.
It might be easy to get some people in government to say that they love your plan and then see progress stall out because the higher-ups aren't actually that invested, which is why Lyric's organization is closely tracking where the real progress is.
Granted, it's not a legally binding document for those folks, but that is the standard that my organization and coalitions continue to use to evaluate their progress, including publicly. And that's where you then do start to hear, well, this is really hard.
Because creating a world where U.S. foreign policy is good for people, peace, and planet means that we have to go beyond comfortable topics where most people agree.
So there are a number of gender equality, global development, other issues that have plenty of friends.
Feminism isn't one of those issues, except in the UN's Women, Peace, and Security agenda, which falls short of a full feminist agenda. And the upcoming U.S. presidential election doesn't make this kind of ambitious policy work any easier.
Everyone's house is on fire. Everybody's got their hands full. We all have a 925-page document to read about all the ways in which our things are going to come in even more dramatic and ambitious fashion under attack.
Yeah.
And so reserving any mental space or political space or capital for bridge building gets harder. I have always thought of this as a second-term agenda. In the American political context, you're not going to take an incredibly risky and arguably untested step when you have to get reelected.
Lyric says that doesn't mean that the Biden administration has been completely ignoring calls for a U.S. feminist foreign policy, even if it might not want to embrace the label.
What they did do, amazingly, because we've published a scorecard annually on how much of the original agenda they took, is they took a lot of the recommendations, moving the Gender Policy Council out of basically the PR office of the White House into a policy shop and staffing it, having a national gender strategy. Those are wins worth celebrating.
Still, the U.S. doesn't seem ready to take the leap that so many others now have.
They're not going to, I don't think, certainly not this year, announce a feminist foreign policy. Right now, every issue is clawing for its own separate lane and attention. There is no coherent lens through which we see the world. This is how we are reconceptualizing global goods as in our national interest. And this is how we are applying those principles in some of the hard security policy conversations, economic policy conversations, where I would argue that they are still pretty absent.
This is one reason that Lyric says it's important to protect any progress that is made, as in by law. One example of what she's talking about snuck in during the Trump administration. It's called the Women's Economic Empowerment and Entrepreneurship Act of 2018, or the WE Act.
That one, in addition to doing some great work to increase USAID authorities to support small and medium-sized enterprises and various things under that specific thematic umbrella, had a very important other thing that it was doing, which was codifying that it is now mandatory at USAID, and we're sitting here at the USAID Gender Conference, all of this work, a gender analysis is mandatory for every single policy this agency does, for every single program it makes, and that gender equality issues will be mainstreamed throughout all of that. And there are certain steps that have to be taken in order to satisfy that mandate, which has been codified in law.
Lyric says that the current administration could and should do more of this while it can.
I think Argentina is top of mind, where the new president came in and day one of office got rid of the gender ministry, announced a lot of the similar Trumpian language around like we're getting rid of gender identity and race and wokeism and all that stuff.
Which isn't to say that the current administration is perfect. Far from it.
I would argue that even today, a broader approach and a more feminist approach is happening insofar as this administration does link gender to climate change. However, has it transformed their negotiating position at COP? No. Are they visibly bringing women to COP and saying, gender and climate, we should do things here? Yes. So they're still on their pathway. And I think this administration has truly done more than any administration in U.S. history, taking on, as Ambassador Abercrombie Winstanley would say, the pale male Yale characterization of the State Department, and as Joe Biden would say, making our foreign policy look like America. They get that it's a priority, and they're trying to implement it in the time that they have. What I don't think that they are doing is articulating an intersectional vision for how all these things are interrelated and how the U.S. does need to dramatically change its negotiating positions and its practices, its emissions, etc. There's still the thinking of our national interest prevails.
For example, maybe it's not such a bad thing that China is doing a good job on green tech. And maybe in a global pandemic, when we all need vaccines, it wasn't a wise move to hoard our own and stymie our adversaries when they developed and shared theirs, even if ours were better.
And in an election year, that's not going anywhere. The hope is that once you get through a political process, then you can reorient, recharge, and resurge around the policy process that attempts to do a better job of forming our negotiating positions and how we show up in the world around shared interests instead of the traditional ones of might and economic domination.
After the break, against all odds, why this moment might actually be right for real feminist change in the U.S. and how we get there.
I would describe the U.S. in this moment as kind of a failed state, meaning that the state, most of its leaders, certainly the president, are not listening to the people.
This is Dr. Margot Okazawa-Ray.
I am a retired professor emerita at San Francisco State.
And she's one of the founders of an organization called the International Women's Network Against Militarism, which she founded in 1997.
So this is 27 years. What we have been able to do is to think together to understand better, why is this cycle just being repeated and repeated? that militarism and militarization are the only solutions.
And now the U.S.'s national security strategy prioritizes confronting China.
At this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
The day's operation burned down 150 houses. Today's operation is the frustration of Vietnam in miniature. There is little doubt that American firepower can win a military victory here. But to a Vietnamese peasant, it will take more than presidential promises to convince him that we are on his side.
When we started in 1997, nobody here in the U.S. was paying any attention to militarism. U.S. activists are so concerned about domestic policy. So what we were trying to do is help really make the connection between domestic and foreign. So the poverty draft, for example, why is it the enlisted ranks predominantly people of color? They're overrepresented in the enlisted.
Those trauma deniers and tuition check signers can say all that we did was ask. And that's the hell of the poverty draft.
People started paying attention after 9/11, but it was then kind of the focus of, war on terror. But now I think, almost 25 years later, really trying to get people to understand that militarism and militarization isn't just about active wars or active acts of aggression. Militarism and militarization are really processes and values that become deeply embedded, in this case, in the United States, so that so much of the ideology supports militarism.
When all you have is a hammer, as it were, everything starts to look like a nail. But Margot says it doesn't have to be this way.
I see these crises as opportunities, but we need certain kinds of leadership. And I'm thinking, as the old Sweet Honey in the Rock song says, we're the ones we've been waiting for. Because our state's leaders are not there. Our corporate leaders certainly are not there. And so, who are the we? Who are the we that we've been waiting for? And I think it's us.
We are the ones we've been waiting. We are the ones.
And the changes we can make? She told us even seemingly small steps toward progress can make a huge difference. Something as simple as translation, for example.
So there was a moment when our International Women's Network Against Militarism was just having its first meeting in Okinawa. We had feminists from Korea, South Korea, Philippines, the US, Japan, and Okinawa. And for me, it was a transformative moment. We forgot about the Tagalog speakers. We forgot about the Korean speakers. We didn't pay attention. So in that moment, we were just kind of blown away because, first of all, we were so nervous about this gathering. English and Japanese, the dominant countries. So we were thinking about those two only. So ever since that, our network made it an explicit point to say interpretation and translation are political acts.
When they convened again a couple of years later, the organization came up with something that they called the Feminist Activist Glossary. It was a tool to make sure that even abstract concepts that didn't really translate would be deeply understood by all of the participants.
The word that always comes to mind is this concept in Korean called Shinsei Taryong. It's a concept that talks about an experience of pain, of storytelling, anguish, hardship, right? It's all these concepts bound up in this one word. There's no simple equivalent. Shinsei Taryong means pain. It's more than that, right? It's more complex.
Margot says that the change that she wants to see has to come from this same spirit of humility and collaboration.
I think in the US, we think about humility as somehow making yourself smaller and giving people other space. You know what I mean? It's very technical. And I was thinking, what if we thought about humility really as interdependence and recognizing that we're always standing on others' shoulders? So it's not about making ourselves smaller. In fact, it's about expanding our connections. My deepest yearning is really, really, really to create places, create conditions, institutions that will bring out the best in all of us as human beings, which then means that we will be working together to build a culture of life that goes against the dominant culture of killing that we're facing every day.
There's been problems from the beginning. We've been questioning why women didn't have power from the beginning. We've been questioning why people were discriminated against, even though we're all human beings from the beginning. We've been questioning this concept of private property and of hoarding wealth from the beginning. And this is all baked into this political structure.
Janine also told us that when we start to look more closely at this tension between violence and care, it paints a stark picture of American exceptionalism.
Why are we one of the countries with the highest rate of imprisonment of our own citizens per capita? Why are we one of the countries with the highest rate of income inequality in the world? Why are we one of the countries where maternal deaths are on the rise? There's a lot of things we are actually failing at if you look at the hard data. But that's something that the average American doesn't really know, because we've been taught to believe in that we're just exceptional and we're doing well across the board, and that being here is a privilege and something that makes us better off than the majority of the world.
This is one of the reasons why almost all of the activists, experts, academics that we spoke with also told us that if the U.S. has any hope of adopting more feminist policies, that change will have to come from the people.
I think what's become very clear is that it's not going to come from the top down. Even though that would be the simplest, easiest, most effective way to put something like that in, this is going to be something that needs to come from the people and be a bottom-up initiative and a demand for the future of our politics. Because, we're in a crisis right now.
But by bottom up, she wants to be clear. She's not talking about the presidential election.
And it's been so frustrating to see how people are only concerned about the democratic project, our civic engagement when it comes to the federal presidential election, because I think it would be more effective and more necessary for us to start thinking more down ballot elections, local elections, really critically analyzing our entire system of power. But also naming that it's not just the responsibility of people to go out and vote, but the responsibility of those in power to fix some of the systemic and endemic issues that exist in our political system. I mean, it's common knowledge now that there's corporate capture, that these super PACs have corrupted our government and the democratic process, that our representatives, once they're in office, have little accountability to the communities that they represent. And I think that until we address all of those things as a whole, I'm going to continue to be sick and tired of people telling us to get out to vote every presidential election.
Janine isn't just lodging complaints here. In 2018, she ran to become the Public Regulation Commissioner of her district in New Mexico.
As a community organizer and human rights advocate, now Yazzie is running for Public Regulation Commissioner to put New Mexico's working families first.
And while she's not running again now, she does believe that all of the things that we've all experienced since 2018, they've opened up an even better opportunity for change.
I'm hoping that in this critical moment where people are overwhelmed with the grief and the anger and the fatigue of witnessing all of these atrocities being carried out with our tax dollars, that we can also capture this as a moment to get people to understand that it's our responsibility to care about our foreign policy and to be able to better see those connections to some of our domestic conditions and our domestic policies. and the ways that they cause harm to our own population. And so I'm hoping that as terrible as this moment is, it also represents an opportunity to make those linkages stronger so that we can better mobilize with a deeper consciousness as an American public, with more solidarity and more commitment to transforming a culture of violence to one of care and of peace.
Standing here in the year 2024, the fact of the matter is that it does not look like the U.S. is going to adopt a feminist foreign policy anytime soon. I know, that's a shocker. It also looks like those countries who have adopted feminist foreign policies still have a whole lot of work to do before they get anywhere near a policy that truly prioritizes care in the way that Janine, Margot, and Lyric imagine. But that doesn't mean that it can't or won't get better. This is just the beginning.
You know, I definitely find hope in the feminist foreign policy work. The Dutch commitment to a feminist foreign policy led to the commissioning of their first ever review of racism in the foreign ministry. And guess what? They found there was racism in the foreign ministry. Having to send a letter to Parliament to say, like, here's our plan for how we're going to fix this, that changes people's lives. If none of this happens and we have this interview again in 5 years, I'll be like closing up my shop and moving on to whatever the next actually winnable campaign is. But I think I have seen enough incredibly talented, savvy, and committed individuals working, I believe, very faithfully toward these goals and asking themselves every day, what's in my lane? What do I have the power to move forward today? I think it's got proof of concept, but we still live in the world we live in, so we'll see.
Things That Go Boom is distributed by Inkstick Media and PRX. This is our final episode of the season. We're going to miss you guys, but we'll be back with season 10 later this year. In the meantime, pop on over to our socials at Inkstick Media to say hi, or you can suggest a topic that you'd like us to explore. And if you feel so inclined, consider a tax-deductible donation to support our work. You can do that at inkstickmedia.com or by texting the code GOBOOM to 44321. That's the code GOBOOM to 44321. This show is free, and it always will be. But it's not free to produce. We depend on your support to keep the doors open at Things That Go Boom. And we are so, so grateful for every penny. This episode was produced by Nikki Galtland and edited by Katie Toth. The music for our show is written by Darian Schulman, and Robin Wise is our engineer. Additional music in this episode from Al Scorch and Sweet Honey in the Rock. Thank you so much. Links to hear more from them are in the show notes. Thank you, as always, to our supporters and to the foundations that make our work possible. The Carnegie Corporation of New York and Plowshares Fund, as well as Inkstick supporters, including the Cologne Foundation, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Prospect Hill Foundation, and the Jubitz Family Foundation. We'll see you guys all soon.
I have hope because I know I've changed. I was a mess in my 20s, you know,
we all were.
But I think I've become a better person over the decades.
From